Somebody left me a very sad comment on one of my YouTube videos recently, so I just want to read the first part. Steven says, my wife and I bought the Brinzy Eco Glow Safety 600 brooder for our first attempt at raising chicks, and it was a disaster. We lost every chick within 48 hours, and every one of them died under the plate. The comment goes on with a lot of details, but I want to talk about this today, about why you might have every single one of your chicks die in a short period of time. I want to talk about if your brooder plate could be the cause of that, or what other things could be the cause of that. But first, Steven and Steven's wife, I am so sorry to hear that this happened to you. I have not had something like this happen to me, but I know that I would find it absolutely devastating. And it's bad for anyone, but when this is your first time raising chicks, and you guys through your comment have told me that you put a lot of time into learning how to do this correctly, you weren't winging it. And for something like this to happen is just, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And I am really, truly sorry that you've experienced this. This should not have happened to you. Something definitely went really wrong. And I hope that if you really want chickens, you're not too discouraged by this, that you will try again. Although, as you know, you definitely want to figure out what caused it, because if it happened again, oh my gosh, sorry guys, this stuff really bothers me. Losing chickens is so hard, and just the thought of waking up to finding, or walking into the room to finding them all dead is just horrible. So I'm gonna help you with what I can here. I don't know 100% what happened here for sure, but we can walk through some ideas and hopefully get you better set up for next time. And so Steven in his comment thinks that it might be the brooder plate being too hot that ended up killing his chicks. And that's something we should think about. I first want to talk about some other things to see if we can eliminate some other things to make sure that they didn't happen first, because some of these things are unfortunately common. And then we're going to get into brooder plates, and could a brooder plate actually kill your chicks? But first I want to say, Steven, from your comment, I'm a little bit uncertain about one of the details here, and that is the timing of their deaths, because you said they all died within 48 hours. But you also said we had chicks that were super active during the day and going in and out from under the plate and eating and drinking, and then hours into the night dead under the plate. And so my question is, did they all die under the plate at night? Or was this more sporadic, where throughout the day they were also dying? Because that really could make a difference in what caused it, or in getting an idea of what happened. Because if it was a little more sporadic, then that does kind of introduce the idea of perhaps something going wrong inside them, genetic or disease-wise. But because you're telling me that they seem to be super healthy, and you haven't said that they seemed sick at all, I am going to assume that this probably isn't disease related and is actually something to do with the brooding environment. But that's just one thing to think about, that I couldn't say that wasn't so for certain. And so when you have seemingly healthy chicks all die at once, that almost always is going to be some kind of problem with the environment. And the most common one is a chemical problem. So the first question is, did you use any cleaning supplies anywhere around your brooder setup at all? Either in your brooder or outside of your brooder? Did you spray air freshener? Did you use something on their feeder and waterers? And even if you did that on the feeders and waters and things, that doesn't mean that that killed them, but that's something you need to kind of think about, is what kind of chemicals did you introduce to these chicks, if any? And so with feeders and waters, I always use plastic ones, and I clean them with vinegar because that's very safe for chicks. But there are some things that could hurt chicks. Chicks are really sensitive to chemicals. They are really sensitive to fumes. So one time I got this anecdote where somebody told me that they it was their daughter. So they had, I can't remember if it was a glass brooder or if it was a bin, like a plastic bin, but it was getting kind of dirty. And so this little girl went in to clean it so the chicks could see out better. And she just sprayed some kind of window cleaner and rubbed it down. And then the next time they went into the room, all of the chicks were dead. So is there anything like that that could have happened? That's the first question. The second question is, do you cook with Teflon, and would your chicks have been exposed to that at all? So if you're brooding in an area that is near your kitchen and you're cooking on Teflon, that can be very, very dangerous for birds. It's not usual for chicks and brooders to die that way because the fumes or the chemicals from that don't actually get to them in a normal brooding space, but maybe you're set up in a way that it could. So that's the second thing to consider. Third thing is degassing. And so this is a weird topic, and I talked about this in my course on raising chicks because I just want to make sure everybody has all the possible information out there. But I get uncomfortable talking about it because there's not science to back it up. It's all 100% anecdotes, but there are many, many anecdotes on two different types of degassing things possibly going on. And one is that a lot of people have had chicks die in plastic bins, and some people have attributed some kind of degassing from that bin, or even, again, if you used a cleaning supply on it. But some people, they said there are smells coming off, kind of plasticky chemical smells coming off of the bin. And I think especially if you're applying heat, if you had a heat lamp or heat from your brooding, 'cause it sounds like your brooding plate, we'll get into it, but it was emitting a bunch of heat that it shouldn't have been emitting. So perhaps if you had this smaller space and the plastic was heating up, and it could have degassed. And again, these are anecdotes, but this is something I hear a lot. So that's a possibility. The other possibility, also from anecdotes, is that a lot of people have claimed that with certain brands of brooding plates that they degas and they are letting off some kind of gas. And a lot of people have attributed this kind of very fast mass chick death to brooder plates degassing. And I say a lot, it's not really that, it's not nearly as many as people who make that claim for plastic bins. But it is something that people have claimed. And again, they've said that they can really smell it coming off of the brooder plate. And so if you've taken my course on raising chicks, it's one of the reasons I talk about in there. I always recommend that you plug in that brooder plate, and if you smell something, definitely keep it plugged in, plug it in for a couple of weeks before you get your chicks to get that off gassing. Although if I smelled stuff, I'd be worried about using it at all, to be honest. But that is the advice that you get out there, is to just plug it in, let all that degassing happen long before your chicks come, and then use it. Again, anecdotes, but that's something to think about. Did you have weird smells coming off of your brooder plate? Another thing is, did you feed them anything other than chick feed? A lot of people like to just kind of give their chicks treats here and there, but chicks are very sensitive nutritionally, and they can kind of get poisoned by something. So if you gave them something salty, they could actually get salt poisoning from eating stuff with too much salt. I doubt that you've done that, but that's one more thing to consider. And then the last thing is, and I don't know, you might have mentioned this in your comment. It didn't stick out to me because it didn't seem to be an important detail when I was reading through it. But the last thing is that, did you have your chicks shipped? Because research studies show that when you have chicks shipped, the mortality rate is significantly higher in the first week or two. And if it took a really long time for your chicks to get there, that could really cause some stress in them. It sounds like your chicks were doing very well from the way you described it, so I doubt that that is the cause either. But that's just something to think about. Did they undergo a huge amount of stress at some point between them hatching and you receiving them? But I would expect they would have been showing some kind of symptoms of weakness. And I know sometimes when they're shipped like that, they're just much more susceptible to illness. But it's just, they all just died so fast and so quickly without symptoms. So I doubt very much that that was the case with yours. So Stephen, let's get to your hypothesis, which is that the cause of the death could have been the heat plate being too hot. And so Stephen says that they watched my video where I talk about how brooder heat plates can be, some of them are just too hot for chicks. And he says that they got an infrared thermometer. They turned on their heat plate for 10 minutes, and then they found that the temperature was just under 120 degrees. And this is telling. He says that we could barely keep our finger on the plate without the urge to yank it off due to the heat. That is too hot. That is way too hot. You should not touch your heat plate and feel like if you leave your hand there, it's going to burn you. And unfortunately, I have found this in more than one brand of heat plate. And again, there are lots of anecdotes that have found this for certain brands too. And I even went back to my first heat plate that I ever used, because it was a very big one, because I raised 30 chicks starting out. And I thought that it was a good heat plate, so I wanted to recommend it to everybody. And then when I finally found it and turned it on, it turned out that it had this problem too, that it was way, way too hot. But when I was new to chicks, I just didn't know that. I don't think that this is talked about in very many mainstream areas. It's just kind of, you can find it in chicken forums where people bring these things up. But, you know, I had no idea. So I just assumed, I don't even know if I put my hand underneath it. I know we made sure that there was heat coming off of it, but I had no idea it was that hot. And when I look back at the photos of my chicks, we had actually set that heat plate up pretty high. And so these heat plates, you want them so the chicks can press their backs against them. But we did not do that with our first batch of chicks. And I'm very glad we didn't, because that heat plate was way too hot for them. But I did not have any chicks die in that. None of them were pressed up against the heat plate either. But I just want to say this is a common problem, and this is why I recommend the K&H. That's the one that I use. When you touch it, it's kind of I mean, maybe lukewarm, maybe a little bit warmer, but it's just not very warm to the touch. But it does heat up once you're pressed against it, never to the point where it feels like it's burning. The problem with the K&H one is that if you're raising a lot of chicks, it's too small. So you'd have to buy multiple ones, or you're going to have to go with a different brand. And I have recommended for people who want to go with a bigger heat plate, I have recommended the Brinzy Eco Glow, which is the one that Stephen here used. And I always recommend that with the full admission, it's always there in writing that I haven't used it, but this is the one that everybody else in the chicken space is recommending, including people who I trust. And so basically, probably almost anyone you've ever followed online has recommended that brooder. The two who I really trust the most are Kathy Shea Mormino, who's the chicken chick, and Kath Andrews at Raising Happy Chickens. And they both use this brooder and highly recommend it. And I even went back to Kath Andrews at Raising Happy Chickens. She had a review on the Brinzy Eco Glow, and she said that, quote, the black metal warming plate on the underneath of the unit spreads heat evenly and does not get hot. When the chick's body is placed close to it, it transmits direct warmth from the element to the chick. And then she goes on to say, a lot of reviews of this product don't understand this principle, and people get very worried that the unit itself does not get hot. It doesn't need to. So something is not right with Stevens. It shouldn't be getting that hot. It shouldn't be burning. And what I'm very worried about is that I'm wondering if they've changed their model or if this is just a fluke. And the hope is that this is just a fluke. But there are so many of these other brooder plates that have had this problem. So just, I told you that first brooder plate I used got too hot. And then I bought, for my last batch of chicks, I bought another brand that got too hot. And then I never used it. I felt that it got too hot, and I got the K&H brooder, and that's the one I really like. So my worry is that I wonder if Brinzy Eco Glow, if some of the ones they're selling now are too hot. It's concerning. If you guys have a Brinzy Eco Glow, please plug it in, let it sit for 10 minutes, and then tell me how hot it feels to the touch, what your experience has been with it. I'd really like to know, because I do not want to keep recommending this if this is obviously something wrong with it now, if it is getting too hot. And again, this is something I talk about in length in my course, but you always want to test everything in your brooder. And so regardless of what brand you get, even if you get that K&H brand that I like, plug it in for a while and see how hot it gets. Because yes, the K&H has worked perfectly for me, but the Brenzy Eco Glow has worked perfectly for others, and it didn't work for Steven. So always, always, always test these things out. Test them out long enough before you get chicks that you can do something about it before your chicks arrive. But that still brings us to the question of whether this brooder plate killed your chicks or not, because I always think of these brooder plates being too hot that they could burn or hurt the chicks. People have made the claim that it has killed their chicks, but a lot of people raise their chicks in very small brooders, so the chicks could possibly have a hard time getting away from the heat plate. So especially if, 3 sides of it are against walls, and then the chicks are under there at night and they have a hard time getting out. But most of the time, if a chick is too warm, they could just leave the heat plates. They don't have to stay under there. However, I can think of 2 things that maybe could prevent them just in their development from leaving. One of those things is that these chicks died, you said within 48 hours. I'm assuming within 48 hours of life, not within 48 hours of you getting them. It's not that important of a distinction, but all of the academic research shows that in that first day of life especially, and then in most cases in the second day of life, chicks do stay under the brooder plate for most of or under the mama hen for most of the time. They might dart out for little kind of short bursts, but they don't spend much time outside of her. And so I wonder if they and the other thing, which I've talked about this a lot before, is that with these very young chicks that are a couple days old, that all you have to do is put your hand on their back. You just have to cover them and they fall asleep. And so since these chicks were so young, is it that they went under this brooder plate and it pressed against their back, which does seem to just put them to sleep, which isn't something the research talks about, but just do this with when they're 2-day-old chicks. They fall asleep when you put your hand on them. And so maybe just having that brooder plate pressing down on them, kind of keeping them sleeping, and they're just so young and so fragile at this age that maybe when they got too hot, they just weren't waking up. That's a possibility. I don't know. I'm kind of spitballing, but that's something that I could imagine could have happened. The second thing is, and again, this goes back to timing, because I don't know exactly when these chicks died. I know you said some of them died in the night. And so especially if all of them died in the night, then this explanation might cover that. And that's that chicks, young and older, but especially young, they are kind of terrified at night. If you see them go to bed, they're screaming. It's a big thing to get, they're just distress calling. And in nature, the mother hen does this purring noise that kind of gets them all under her and calm down. In the brooder, we don't have that. I wish there was a brooder plate where you could turn that noise on. Not yet made. Great idea though. But night is very scary for chicks. If they're not under the mother hen, they're gonna die. They're gonna freeze to death, or something's gonna get them. And so I wonder if that, and then also even with adult chickens, when they get into a very deep sleep, it can be hard for them to wake sometimes, and they just get in these really, really deep slumbers in the dark. And that's why a lot of people will go in and do chicken checks after dark, because their chickens are almost kind of zombie-like and they don't freak out. They just go in with their headlamps to do health checks. So maybe it was something like that, where they're just in this deep slumber, or they're afraid to leave the safety of the brooder because it's dark out, and so they just cook to death underneath it. I think those could be possibilities. I do wish that I had a straight answer for you where I could tell you that, yes, this is exactly why they died, or no, there's no way they die from that. They'd leave the heat plate. I don't know. I think it is possible. I feel very bad that I recommended this plate. You said you watched my video on how not to kill your chicks. And that does link to my brooder setup, where I do recommend the Brinzy Eco Glow for larger broods. And so if you got that for me, I feel horrible. I like that. That's horrible. I'm sorry. But I'm sorry. I am sorry. And I'm sorry that this happened to you anyway. And I would like to know if people have had similar experiences. But I hope that gives you some idea for why your chicks might just die in a short period of time, seemingly healthy. For those of you who haven't seen my video on how not to kill your chicks, it's a great video for beginners. If you don't know anything about birds, there are a lot of ways you can accidentally harm your chicks that you just never even think of. So check out that video here. And Stephen, best of luck. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you'll still consider moving forward with your chicken plans.